I want to say this in case, like any fellow ministers slash people of faith that come from a Christian tradition are watching. You know, the shame, the shame, the shame for all of us who might be in this tradition at all is that if there's anything that we were supposed to have learned from our tradition is that like the inevitability of facing death when you have to counter empire and stand on the side of the oppressed is the foundation. Like you cannot know who Jesus is as a historical figure or not. Like the story, you can't read it without realizing that this is the reality that we live in. This is our reality. Like if you want to witness on behalf of the people who are being oppressed by whatever empire is going on, they're going to try to kill you and imprison you. This is the New Testament. This is like what the New Testament is, besides all the craziness going on. That's the fundamental through line.
Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we interview Darren, who is a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA in Wisconsin. This conversation started as a text and Google Doc exchange around the story of Amalek within the Old Testament of the Christian Bible and the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. We talk about how we should understand the relationship between these biblical stories and documented history, their relationship to the Gaza genocide, and how we might fit our analyses of these narratives into the relationship between U.S. imperialism and Zionism. Along the way, Darren engages with questions of faith practice, the relative absence and silence of particularly Euro-American liberal Christian congregations among those standing in defense of Palestinian lives and Palestinian sovereignty. Darren also discusses how the gears of U.S. fascism called for in documents like Project 2025, and specifically related to this conversation, Project Esther, which are being enacted through the Trump administration, are being lubricated by the absurd and ethically vacuous nature of U.S. liberalism. A couple of things to mention. This conversation was recorded 10 days ago, so the 8th anniversary episode we mentioned is currently already out on our YouTube channel. In addition to reflections from Josh and myself, it featured special appearances from Stefano Harney, Renee Johnston, Fred Moten, Sina Rahmani, and Laura Shihai. A big thank you to all of them for stopping by, and to everybody who watched live and all the people who have supported us over the years. This episode was also recorded before the 2nd anniversary of Tufan al-Aqsa and before the latest ceasefire agreement. We have episodes on the YouTube channel about those developments as well, one putting Abdul Jawad Omar and Laura Shihai in conversation together for the first time, and the other with Nora Barros Friedman from Electronic Intifada and Sina Rahmani from The East is a Podcast. As always, the absolute best way to support us and to help us continue to sustain our work and hopefully grow as a project is to become a patron of the show at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism or support us through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Shout out to all the people who gave us a little something on our 8th anniversary. Now, here is our conversation with Darren on biblical rationales for genocide. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with my friend Darren, who many of you actually probably know from study groups and things like that in the past. And he and I have had kind of an ongoing conversation. Darren's a minister, and about, some of the biblical, origins or ideas, related to the genocidal war against Palestinians that has come about, particularly in the wake of the October 7th rebellions. So we're going to dig into that a little bit today, some of the biblical aspects, some of the lack of historical aspect, really, and just talk about it, talk about what does this all mean, and why do we care, and how we should include this in the importance of this in our overall analysis, and as well as just kind of understanding some of the ideas and concepts that are being raised when, for instance, Benjamin Netanyahu or other members of the Israeli government talk about Amalek and the Amalekites and this kind of stuff. And so, all right, without further ado, Darren, welcome to the show, buddy. It's good to be with you. I was trying to think about this beforehand. Maybe I've had somebody on before who's a minister in some capacity and I don't know it. I've had imams on the show before. I know that. But it's funny because I did grow up in the church in UCC at least, and every once in a while that'll kind of weave its way into a discussion or a conversation in passing, but never really spent a lot of time bringing folks on with a perspective from the church, from a Protestant background and that kind of thing. And so I'm looking forward to this. It's something different and new. You and I obviously have known each other for a few years now and have had a lot of time a good bit of time to talk over the years. And this particular history is something that obviously we've talked about elements of it with Adnan Hussein, on the conversations about his work around the Crusades and some of the myths that are related to, the history of the Crusades that kind of persist, those connections between certain biblical narratives and settler colonialism or Zionism or Christian Zionism and that kind of stuff. But what we're going to dig into a little bit here is really the relationship with Israel and to maybe a different extent to Judaism and also to large swaths of Christianity, right? Because what we're talking about is the Old Testament, right? Which, like you and I have kind of joked that for a lot of Christians, this is kind of like the belligerent uncle that you don't bring up that much, it's kind of what we tiptoe around and, depending. I mean, I think right-wing Christianity has a much fuller embrace of the Old Testament and uses it in certain ways. But folks that are more liberal or more left-leaning within Christian faiths, tend to focus really heavily on the New Testament, on the life of Jesus, and, trying to draw progressive, social justice-oriented kind of lessons from that portion of the Bible, of which there are many. And so before we get into it, I just want to take a moment and you can introduce yourself a little bit to the audience in whatever way you would like.
Yeah. So first of all, just super honored to be here. Here in the intro and thinking that my face was going to come up there afterwards is, thinking about all the other people that I've watched and listened to over the years before it was on video. Yeah. So a great honor. Thank you so much. So I am a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA in Wisconsin, kind of in between Milwaukee and Chicago. I guess kind of situating me, I adhere to many of the same things that the rest of you do. Listen to this show, read the things that you read, and try to make it make sense while maintaining a certain faith that, as I've said to Jared many times, like I don't know, kind of like will not let me go. It's not like and maybe some of this language actually after 9/11 kind of took me out of the church for a while, but anyway, yeah. So just honored to be here. I look forward to the conversation as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, and I look forward to it as well. So, do you want to start with kind of an overview, and then, or should we start with the question of why do we care?
Well, maybe we can do both at the same time. So I do think, I mean, like this question, and this conversation we're having right now kind of started around you sending me a text about the Amalek stuff. And I think it's a really fascinating thing to dig into the whole narrative as it appears through the Bible, because, as we talked before, like it just kind of like, it seems to come out of nowhere. in many ways, and it seems to just kind of like float underneath the surface. But it also is like, in all of its different ways that it appears, like this almost perfect propaganda. If you want to someday have state power and be genocidal, it's like it offers you every way to think about like why you should do that. So that's I think one reason to look at it is that I don't think it offers like a motivation, but I think it offers a rationale. Like it's one of those things that can be pulled out, and if you know even bits of the story, or if you think it resonates with like what God wants for Israel, like wherever you stand, like you just accept it automatically in a way. And the way that it's been used throughout history is to kind of like invoke like the idea, especially as it relates to like an enemy trying to come and get you, but without saying like that after that we go and like slaughter them, like it just kind of like it brings up the first half and like leaves off the second half, but in leaving that silent, kind of like reauthorizes it in a way, that's different than if you had to say that part out loud all the time, and I mean, whenever Netanyahu brings it up after October 7th, he mentions it. He says that we're going to fight, but he doesn't, say anything about the side of like God declaring war on Amalek from generation to generation and that sort of thing. He just mentions that we need to remember Amalek because they're always coming to get us, and leaves off the second part. And we can talk a little bit about, when South Africa brought that phrase up, and then, there's an article I sent you that like where the Netanyahu's office is like, hey, come on, like this is part of our tradition. Like we just, like, like the Holocaust Museum has this kind of phrasing in there, like you can't say that that's genocidal, well, maybe not if you know the whole story.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. Well, let's do the story, right? Because I think that the story is something that gets kind of hinted at and people know parts of it, but you really kind of have done the work to lay this all out. And so, yeah, if you could just talk about the story in its kind of like full form as you understand it.
Right. So the Amalekites are like first mentioned in the book of Genesis, and it just talks about kind of like a land of theirs, which is interesting again because they haven't been born yet. They don't exist yet. So I mean, obviously that gets to how the narrative is constructed. But the first time that we hear about them, in any significant sense, comes in the book of Exodus, and it happens kind of after the people. And this is a tough thing too. Like as we talk, I'm just going to use the shorthand, the people. Like I think because like they're not really Israel yet, and then like the whole idea of who's Israel and who's Judea and who's and also that plays into how people use these stories. So in the text they're referred to as Israel. But you know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to be careful about how these things, because I think this is something that we in the church deal with a lot, because hymns and texts and things mention Israel and people automatically conflate it with the modern state of Israel. And
I think this is a good point to like just start at and say, right? Because this is the freaking Ted Cruz versus Tucker Carlson, like, moment.
Yeah.
Right. Which is that when Israel is referred to in the Bible, it is obviously not the nation state that we know today. It is a group of people. And so in some ways, on one end, it is Israel, right? At least, or a biblical Israel, right? But what that means actually doesn't have anything to do with the current nation state. It's a story about a group of
Right.
people.
Yeah. And the text references them as Israel. But of course, we imagine that this text was, finished, sometime while the people were in like Babylonian captivity or something many, many thousands of years later. So sorry about that, sorry about the caveat there, but I do think it's incredibly important to think about every time you hear the word, especially when you're, talking about biblical things and that sort of stuff, is to think, okay, well, actually, who's being talked about here? And I'll say that historically, probably who these people are, if there is a historical referent, is some people who probably were like enslaved or part of, in Egypt, but a small band of people who somehow, got out, whether there was all this, craziness attached to it. But like there's, like Egyptians have very good records, going back way further than this. So the idea that it doesn't come up in any of their records,
Right. I mean,
I already see that. Like that's already. But I mean, but we do, it's a possibility that this group of people came into the region into what we call what was called Canaan back then, and their particular understanding of their God and their particular story of defeat of the Egyptians actually was a convincing narrative to the people who were dealing with what they were dealing with at the time, and connecting all this together later made sense, to people to say, we are Israel, like in this way,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it's a great point that you're bringing up, and it's an important one. I mean, one is that there's never been any clear historical archaeological backdrop through which people can say, yeah, what goes on in the Exodus narrative in the Bible is something historical that we can say these are its contours, these are its actors, this is what like that. Just there isn't that record, right? And so then it's a story, right? And it's a story that resonates for some reason, and maybe some of those reasons of resonance are partially based in some historical things, or like a lot of stories, maybe they're, maybe it has some resonance to something, right? But it is completely made up, right? Like those are, I think, the ways I think about that. Yeah.
Right. Well, so I'll try to get back to telling the actual story. So these people called Israel in this text, right? So they come out of Egypt. They're the chapters leading up to the chapter that mentions Amalek. Part of it is like the song of like Moses's sister after the waters have come and swallowed up all the Egyptians, and it talks about how their foes were going to devour them, and so on and so forth, and how they prevailed, and how all the people around in all of the land around were trembling in fear and awe because of what God has done for this people. And then they kind of keep traveling. The next story is kind of like about how God provides them food, the manna, if you know the story, and the quail, and then God provides them water from a rock with Moses's staff that he has, which becomes important. So right after that, it just kind of jumps in to say that Amalek came out and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And then it tells the story of how Moses instructs Joshua, the Joshua of the book of Joshua, and they form a group of people. They go out, and basically the story is Moses stands on a hill. When he raises his staff, the people are defeating the Amaleks. Whenever his arm drops, the Amaleks start to win. So Aaron and Hur come and hold up his arm so that they can defeat the Amalekites, which I'll caveat by saying that, this is, after October 7th, this was a narrative that like conservative Christians pick up to basically say that, that we are Aaron and Hur, and we lift up the arm of Israel basically by bombs and money, and so that they can defeat the Amalekites. And so there's some fascinating sermons to be had there. But then the interesting thing after that happens, which is kind of like, these battles happen, it's not unusual to have these skirmishes or whatever. But then after it's over, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And then it says, the Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages. So a couple of interesting things. This is the first time that any kind of reference to writing is mentioned in the Bible. And, just this idea that this is what becomes interesting later on, is that you write down this thing so that you remember it. But the thing that you remember is to blot out the memory, so this it becomes this thing that is, impossible to do in a way, which kind of keeps it going, because you can't actually do because you're always remembering the thing that you're trying to forget or to blot out, So, the interesting thing here is that in this text, it's God that's going to, is going to do the warring, and is going to be doing the blotting out. We can come back to the references in the book of Numbers, because it has more to do with the I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So we can come back to that. But then the next one that's continued in a reference is in Deuteronomy. And it's interesting too, because it comes in the midst of just the telling of these laws, use honest measures when you measure things out, and don't, cheat people, don't take your neighbor's donkey, like those kind of things. And then all of a sudden it's just remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. How they basically they didn't fear God. They surprised you. You were famished and weary, and they cut down the stragglers at your rear. And then it says, therefore, when God brings you into safety from all the enemies around you in the land that God is giving you as your hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So it starts with remember. It ends with this exclamation point, do not forget. And in the middle, blot out the memory. So, but, and this one is interesting because it highlights the innocence and weakness of the people at the moment, and that this was a surprise attack. Commentators today, refer to it as a terror attack, the perfect terror attack, And so, and this is the text that's read the Sabbath before Purim, which we can talk about when we get to the book of Esther. But what's interesting about it is that the Exodus story is read on Purim, but before you get to the two texts that kind of highlight the victorious nature of the people, the week before you highlight the innocent victim narrative of the people, and then you move into it, into the next part. You want me to keep going? Do you have any questions along the way?
I think story time is great, because I think it's good. It's good to have all of this before we kind of start to dig into deeper, what is this all, why does this matter? What does it mean?
Yeah. So then the next, I would just mention too that I'm looking at this. This is the Jewish Study Bible, which is the Tanakh from the Jewish Publication Society, which has commentary along the side of it. And this is this is a pretty popular Bible in the Jewish tradition. And so in the Exodus narrative, where it talks about the Amalekites, it says, in later Jewish tradition, Amalek comes to symbolize anti-Semites in general. So that's your, that's the Study Bible, trying to help you understand this this parallel, and then in the Deuteronomy text, it says Amalek later became a symbol for any enemy of Israel. So just so you understand as you're reading this. Yeah. So then the next big, the next reference, which is one that I think, that the South African case brought up this text, and then Nick on Red Nation just did a talk through of the recent case, or the recent, I don't know what they call what the UN put out recently saying it's a genocide, but references this text in 1 Samuel 15, where basically God tells King Saul that he needs to go out and basically go slaughter the Amalekites, every man, woman, child, camel, donkey, cattle, whatever, everything has to be destroyed. And Saul goes and fights the Amalekites, but he decides to spare the king, whose name is Agag, which will become important later. But he spares the king, and he also basically what he says is like, my soldiers wanted some of the nicest stuff, so I let them keep it. So he's like, so then he goes to Samuel, who's the one who told him that the Lord had told him to do this, comes and basically is like, what's going on here? Actually, it's a pretty good line, from the prophet. He comes and like Saul's like, hey, we did what you said, and he's like, well, what's all this like bleating of sheep? Like, why do I hear all this noise around me if like you did what you were supposed to do? And then Saul makes excuses, and then Samuel basically says, like, because you didn't do what you were told to do, your kingdom is being taken away from you. Like, because you didn't genocide the Amalekites, you lose your kingdom, and it's going to pass on. Well, to David is who it's going to pass on to, but it's going to pass on from you. And it's just, I mean, again, from a propaganda point of view, like basically, if someone attacks you, or you have this enemy, this perpetual enemy out there, and if you don't utterly destroy them, you could lose your political power. You could lose your sovereignty. You could lose your whatever, So that becomes, it's just a great way to convince people that you should not spare folks, And in the interpretation of it over time is kind of like this idea of, you can show too much mercy. And if you show mercy, it can be a foolish thing to do, and just, you have to be very careful to not ever show mercy in this way, because it will come back and, to your detriment one way or another.
Yeah. I'll just stop there for a second and just say, like, Cobra Kai, but also, it's I mean, I mentioned to you when we were talking before we started that one of the things in this story that, that resonates with other stuff that I've read, right, is like when you read, and I'm sure I have not spent as much time on war doctrine and war literature as I have on counterinsurgency doctrine and literature, which is obviously a subset of the first group of texts.
Oh, yeah.
So I imagine it's present in both places. But Orasani Burton and I did this, 2-part series on Frank Kitson and, low intensity operations. And in it, he takes a lot of, he sort of pats himself on the back for his cute little reference to Mao and this idea of, a fish, being a gorilla that needs to swim in the water, and this idea, and Kitson saying, well, then we need to poison the water. And, I've talked throughout, I think as we did that conversation, we referenced Gaza in that context as well. But this, that this idea that I think is hard for us to accept and to wrap our minds around, because there's so much, because we're decent people on one hand, but also because there's like, within humanitarian law and all of these things, right, there is this notion that, civilian infrastructure and food sources, and that these things are to be protected, and that even as you're fighting, an enemy, that there are rules that you need to play by in order to do so in some sort of ethical manner, which we know a lot of this is its own mythology, right?
Right.
But it is, as we try to make sense of something like Gaza, but as we also read this story, right, one of the things that I found that stood out to me right, was that this is, a biblical text that crosses through the part of the Bible that both, Jewish people and, Christians read and consider a part of their faith, that is basically saying the same thing. It's that, and you will be punished if you, it's like, yes, poison the water, and you will be punished if you don't poison the water. And, as you say, like, there is a connection very much to mercy there, right? Of like, because some modicum of mercy would say, well, actually, we can't poison the water, like this is too far.
Right.
And what this text is doing, as well as certain other, military doctrines do, is say, you need to go beyond what you think is too far, and
Right.
so
yeah. There's like, I mean, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, that's the thing that's probably like the most terrifying thing about it is that like this is a text telling you that God, however you think about that, like there is a universal like law somewhere, that to protect yourself, like there are times when you have to just completely annihilate another people, and of course, like in the biblical text, like since it's tied to this thread, like this comes as a thread through, like the Torah with the Exodus, Deuteronomy, then into this, into the prophets with this, like, it's like, well, we told you so. Like, you didn't blot out the memory. Now, like, now here we are again, and you're in this place, What's interesting is that there's a debate around whether, like, because this idea is kind of like, the word for it is like haram, like our prescription, like that you, like this idea of totally destroying people, property, possessions, this idea, it's a rare thing, thankfully, what I mean, like that it comes up, but then like part of the debate is like is try to say, well, like this was a tradition in like the ancient Near East, as they call it. But then there's other people who are like, well, I don't really see evidence of this kind of like this same kind of thing, being asked for. So like that's another kind of debate in the midst of this, is like, how was this just picking up on what other people were doing, or is this like a unique kind of thing for this tradition that you would say prescribe this, like. And I think, and then the other part of it is that you would direct that toward like a group, like a particular group of people, like over time. Like there's maybe like some examples of like a particular instance, like where you would say, okay, this was done or this was called for. But again, like the crazy thing about this is that it's like in perpetuity, like, like you can't stop doing this, which is interesting because of course, it seems like that people come along and do eliminate the Amalekites, like in the tradition, like it happened in Exodus, like that apparently like they won, like they kept Moses' arms up, so on and so forth. But of course, then they reappear, like again. And so it's like, well, we keep utterly destroying them, but they keep appearing, which is a whole nother, like a whole nother thing. But yeah, I think when you bring it to today, when you bring it to what's happening today, it's, again, like, to me, it is like a back of the mind rationalization. Like, it's like, you don't have to talk about this all the time. You don't have to, you don't have to like go into detail about it. You just have to pop up like this little phrase and the historical memory kind of kicks in.
Yeah.
So, which I think is a good transition into like the last little piece of the story that I think is important.
Let me just say something before we go there, which is like, obviously we're reading The Accumulation of Wastes right now by Ali Qadri, right? And like, I just think it's one of the things that we're talking about before too was like, and Justin Potter brought this up in his conversation with Nick around the same, topic, Nick Estes, and the that like who created this, right? And and what was their rationale, and I think, or what was their reason for this, like what and I think that one thing we could say, right, is that for something like Ali Qadri's work on the accumulation of waste, which is this idea, which I'm not going to be able to totally encapsulate because it's deep, right? But the idea,
I'll have to.
yeah, the idea is that is that waste, which is both a substance that is created, but also a kind of dialectical process of waste making that produces value, is a part of capitalism and always has been. It's, we can think of it as primitive accumulation and so on. But so in his analysis, genocide is something structural to the capitalist system and its ability to overcome crises or deal with its own crises of accumulation, right? And so in that sense, you can see, that's an argument where you could say, well, 'cause there's a material base for these types of actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then a story like this also just works really nicely with that material base. And,
Yeah.
there's a lot of other examples that we could think about it, Imperial 80s and all of this,
Yeah.
all these stories that we tell about these times when, you have been wronged, basically, and you need to, go Bruce Willis or go Sylvester Stallone
Right.
or whatever, right?
Right.
And show no mercy, and so anyway, I just wanted to say that before we moved into the next section. Yeah.
No, I think that's well said. This is the part that I think is the trickiest part, is like trying to get back to the material reality that spawned this ideology, because it's so far back in the past and so unrelated to like what archaeology can tell us about, that reality. Like it is really hard, especially because, as we can talk about later, but like the general power dynamics is, in all honesty, I mean, and this is, Palestinian folks would tell you, like the people of the land who are being talked about as Israel here, some of them are the people of the land that are being genocided now. Like that's the reality, and their positionality in, the hierarchy or the powers that be, like, was normally on the lower level, like at a survival, let's just make it through this, and let's find a place or a way to be within empire that we might be able to have some sovereignty and some, whatever, so yeah. And so how this comes out, of that, is, again, it's just baffling. I don't really, it doesn't make sense. I think maybe like the only thing that makes sense to me is to have, and I don't know how shaped this was whenever these texts were being written, but like the idea of election, the idea that you are called out as a special people, like you are God's own, and there seems to be a development in the understanding of the divine where it was always localized. So the idea that your God would favor you, sure, like it was localized, so it didn't matter that much. But like as your God starts going with you all over the place, like that starts to be like you are special no matter where you end up, and your God comes with you and like defeats all the other gods. Like that idea of election, what some people talk about, and some people talk about this favorably, like, like from the point of view of the nation of Israel, is like the elect always needs an anti-elect. There needs to be a perpetual enemy to help you to form your understanding of who you are as elect. It just doesn't seem to work otherwise. And I mean, this can be brought up in the, in terms of manifest destiny in the United States, like, whether you're talking about, indigenous people in the beginning, communists later on that get equated with indigenous people, or whether you're talking about, black people in the United States being equated with communists, and I mean, like all that stuff is having an enemy, so that it's clear who you are, and how you are elect.
Yeah.
And I'll just say the last thing I'll say about that is that part of the attachment that Christian Zionists have with Israel is that you get to play this like mirroring election game. oh, see how they are in the midst of this wilderness of Arab foes who are out to get them, but they still survive. Like, and we support them. So like we're in the midst of our wilderness of crazy culture wars and cities that are going to grow and come and get us in the suburbs, like this, it plays on each other. And that's like part of that, like bless the bless and curse the curse, like becomes, plays into that loop, I think, as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I was going to add is that's like, it's fundamental to a lot of national mythology, and especially as you get, liberalism and the nation state and, Locke and Hobbes and all this shit, like they're like
Right.
obsessed with, perpetual enemies and, all of this kind of stuff, which I think is also, as, Andrew Krinks and also, Mark Neoclaus and like, like a lot of this stuff comes out of the Christian tradition into the so-called secular tradition, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. No, for sure. For sure. Well, and I know that this was inspired by Dr. Ball over at Black Liberation Media, but he was talking about listening to The Invention of the Jewish People by Sand. And so I was listening to that too. And like, so that this idea of nationhood and the ways that like the modern state of Israel develops at the time it does, as, like this particular version of nation state, this particular version of national identity is being formed. And the use of this idea of Israel as a nation from the past, like, it's just, the confluence of that is crazy and like really makes a lot of sense to why things are so, like, why it's such a messed up project. You know what I mean? Like the ways that all those things came together, just makes it like just a really messed up project. Obviously. So I'll lead into the next thing by saying that, like, so as a minister, I talk about some stories out of this book to people who supposedly have heard stories out of this book for, some of them 70, 80 years of their life. And I often see little evidence that they picked up on, the things that seem like some of the fundamental truths of the text, in some ways. And that, if you're listening, parishioners, you're wonderful people, but like part of the reason why, like, you could easily dismiss all of this narrative, is the fact that, like, clearly, there are strange people who go and read this stuff regularly, like investigate it, like, and that sort of thing. But the majority of people don't, are not digging into any of this, and the majority of people are not paying attention to any of this. Like, I think I was just, I've seen something. Maybe it was last year that, even like the hard evangelical, that whole branch, like 50% of them attend church regularly. You know what I mean? And then like the other 50%, the idea that they're actually like paying attention to these sermons that be preached, or, or any of this stuff, so you can kind of like dismiss this stuff in a way. But the thing about this narrative is that it gets brought up. It comes out again in the book of Esther, where the villain of that story is called an Agagite, which means that he's the descendant of King Agag, who was the one that Saul didn't kill, Samuel did kill, which brings up a whole nother question, about how his descendants. But anyway, but this guy Haman is his name. He's an Amalekite descendant, and while the people are in Persia, or a group of Jewish people, this is the first time that people are called Jews in the Bible, so we can call them Jewish at this point. Textually, we can call them Jewish. So while the Jews are in Persia, this guy Haman has an inexplicable hatred for the Jews, and is going to try to destroy them. And Esther is someone who's in the royal court of the king, and she is convinced by her uncle Mordecai that she should stand up to go in front of the king and confront this plot, basically, that this Haman person is concocting to get rid of all of the Jewish people in the Persian area. And I will, I will say that, like, the text, the language that Haman uses to describe like why you should get rid of the Jews, it sounds pretty, it's straight good, anti-Semitism. You could hear reverberations, of that of that language in some of the worst periods of, anti-Semitism. So, but what happens is that Esther is successful. She goes before the king. It takes great bravery on her part, to go before the king. You could be killed because you came unannounced or uncalled for or whatever. And it turns out that Haman is hung and all of his 10 sons are hung on the place that he planned to hang Mordecai, which doesn't get brought up as much at Purim. But then in the aftermath of that, because the king had made an edict that Haman had said that he wanted an edict so that he could go and destroy the Jews. So the king had made the edict. Haman was destroyed, and kind of like, it was like, maybe it's not going to happen. But because it was still hanging out there, the Jewish folks were like, hey, we should go and make sure we destroy all the people that might destroy us, just in case. Like, they still got this in mind. So it's kind of like one day they slaughter a bunch of people in some different towns. And then the king asks Esther what they should do. And she's like, I think you should basically, like, the next day you should let them do the same thing. Let them go back and kill some more people. And it's exaggerated, like the numbers are exaggerated, but like it's like thousands of people are killed, and the end of the book is a description of how to set up the holiday of Purim to commemorate this and to remember it, And so I say all that to say that, like, this narrative is intentionally, it's a holiday, like it comes up every year. You read the Deuteronomy story. I mean, most people probably don't go to the Sabbath before, but I understand. but everybody celebrates the holiday, no matter whether you're Reformed or not, or like even just like we would celebrate, a holiday, having the day off or whatever. We would understand the narrative of the holiday, whether we bought into it or not. Like Columbus Day or whatever. We would understand why people are doing it. Thanksgiving or whatever. Like we would understand that. And so, whenever Netanyahu, mentions this Deuteronomy text in the aftermath of October 7th, 23, people understand the through line. They get it, Do you remember the guy's name who just wrote the book, How to Be Jewish After Gaza Genocide? Beinart or something like that?
Hang on.
I think is his name.
Peter. Yeah, it's Peter. So the book is entitled Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning by Peter Beinart.
Yeah. So in that book, he actually has a whole kind of like section on that. He talks about Purim, and I think he says like that the Jewish tradition has this kind of like way of talking about the holidays of they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. But each of them have their own kind of end of the story that's not really mentioned. But so even the Passover narrative, still has like all the plagues that came against Egypt, the destruction of the Egyptian army, and then in some traditions, like the plunder of Egypt as you left, and this story has the eventual slaughter of all of these people, in the tradition, maybe justified because they were coming to get you, you know what I mean? But again, this is that dynamic of, okay, at this particular point, here are these people underneath Persian rule, a small subset of the population, clearly able to be demarcated by their traditions, so on and so forth, and potentially subject to elimination, like that's a reality. But then what happens when you flip it on its head and you are the empire, you are the subject or you are the affiliate, whatever you want to call it. You're the outpost of the empire,
Yeah.
It becomes a totally different story.
Yeah, right. I mean, I know we'll talk about this more, but, there is a kind of question. I mean, I think on one end, one of the issues I have with thinking about some of this history, even as potentially decolonial, anti-colonial, is that, like, I said this to you before we started, but there's never been an anti-colonial movement that has actually said, hey, like what we need to do is, is commit genocide. I mean, there are obviously, Cedric Robinson has that whole thing, right, where he talks about how like, Black people have never been as violent as like white men thought that the situation called for. I mean,
Right.
obviously I'm paraphrasing that, but
Yeah.
it's, something along the lines.
Yeah.
And I think that, what I would say is that the traditions of, anti-colonial struggle and decolonial struggle, while they certainly have, in order to be effective, can't have some kind of moralistic total dismissal of violence and force in that process, right? But at the same time, their purpose is to liberate themselves. And so that's what's one of the things that's interesting to me about that story. And it also, I think, becomes interesting about how, if this is your story, right, or if this is part of your mythology about your group of people, then this is not only authorizing but sort of mandating a level of violence and terror that I would say goes beyond what historical anti-colonial struggles have done, right? And so that's just not interesting in a good way, but an interesting sort of historical problem here is that,
Right.
and I think too, like one of the things for me is, I mean, it's interesting, the question on Purim, and, I don't doubt that, this is part of the tapestry, right, of story and of narrative and mythology and all of that
Right.
people tap into. But I think it's also, it's not, it's not the only thing, right? And I think that, like a lot in my mind lately is like the last conversation I had with Abdul Jawad, where he was like, I think a little bit frustrated with me that that I want to continue to dig into all of these narratives or analyses or justifications of what's happening, right? And I mean, at a certain point, it's like, obviously, I want to understand it. I want to understand all the mechanics of it and what the different factors are, because all of that, I think, presents different opportunities for people to resist in different ways, right? But on the flip side, I do think it's like, his point is in my mind, which I think is something that we could talk about too throughout all of this, is that, he said, look, it's a goal-oriented project, right? Like it's not irrational in a sense of it doesn't make any sense. It has a rationale, which is what
Right.
you started us with, right? Which is like, this provides a rationale that is useful if you want to commit genocide, essentially, right?
Right.
The other thing that's interesting in that story that you just shared, the second part about Persia too, which I don't have any memory of that. But again, my Old Testament is pretty weak. But the notion of this ruler with an inexplicable hatred of Jews in Persia, I mean, this obviously also would seem to be a really neat justification for the modern day state that calls itself Israel in their military strikes on Iran, for instance, and that, that they've had a long, obviously, design on, overthrowing the Iranian Revolution and all of that. So that's just interesting too, as a historical thing.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's one of the justifications that Netanyahu's office uses when combating the South African case with his bringing up Amalek is that, he's like, well, I said Hamas, like I'm going to treat Hamas like Amalek. So it's like, well, we're moving from a people down to a political / whatever, like military entity. But in the years before, he had referred to like all of Iran as Amalek. I mean, like, so it's like, obviously, I mean, we don't need to parse out like how insane this person is and like what their original intention is. But what's fascinating about it is that like, again, like this is a whole nother piece, like people like Netanyahu and the European Jews who became like the majority of Israel, or the leadership of Israel, basically the white European segment of that, don't really have a connection to like they have a connection to these stories, but like they don't never necessarily have a connection to living in the land of it. What I mean? So that's a whole other interesting side of it.
Right on.
And I mean, I think the other thing I guess about Purim is that, like you've seen like the Hamans or the Amalek of the late 1800s, early 1900s were like the Christians that were around the Jewish people who were persecuting them, and then like with the formation of the state of Israel, it becomes the Palestinians or Iran or Iraq, whoever, who are Syrian, whoever. And that transition, that dynamic, again, you're having a story and then your ability to execute the story are two different things. But the fact that you have the story, even when you couldn't execute it, is still like just a super troubling thing that I can't, it's hard to wrap your head around. And like you say, this is just like it's hard to find equivalents of this kind of like haram or prescription type of warfare, like, analogous in the past. This particular way of thinking about your enemies or whatever is unique. I mean, is unique in a way to like, well, us two Europeans sitting here, like it seems like, that we have we do kind of have a corner on this market of thinking this way, like you're saying, like the decolonial struggles, the anti-imperial struggles, like don't like even a terror plot is not meant to go, like 9/11 is not meant to like, destroy every wheat field, or whatever, right. Annihilate all of our, yeah. I mean, I think that all those struggles understand that there's like they understand the difference between the portion of the population who like seeks their destruction and the portion of the population who are like under the boot in a similar way or tangentially, as you are, I mean, the issue with these stories, for me is that like choosing to embrace them fully just puts you on the side of, like just puts you on the wrong side of this whole thing.
Yeah.
That's the point. The way I think about this is these stories in a Christian Zionist taking up of them, in a Zionist taking up of them, and their manipulation by secular people at the same time is basically just another tool of fascism. You know what I mean? Like it's just another tool. So like we should think about them and we should think about the use of them the way we think about combating any way that we see fascism come up, and I won't say like, the little preface, that goes before fascism that, like that we normally denominate that type of activity because, who knows what might happen to us if we're associated with that. But we're not for fascism. We try to fight it wherever we can,
Yeah, appreciate it. I mean, that's the thing. Yeah, right. Like, it is. I mean, I think actually, Justin and Nick, when they did their thing, they entitled it the Book of Genocide, right? And right. I think like that's fitting, yeah. Right? Is like what we are talking about is this biblical story, this biblical narrative, right? That goes across multiple books in the Bible. Like it has, this trajectory. It's referenced back, as you say, and that it's there for that authorization, and it's not and so I think it is important to say that even in the instance where there was an Amalek and there, was it like that, this idea that should be the response, we should reject that,
right.
fully, right? Because I think the idea as I think about it, when you go to like an anti-colonial, decolonial sort of approach, right? A revolutionary approach, and even a Marxist approach, right? The notion is, okay, these people want to do these things to us. These people have done or are doing these things to us. We need to change the conditions so that they can't do these things to us, right? And then also, hopefully in the process of doing that, we can also set things up in such a way that they don't want to do these things to us, and they change their minds about the kind of people that they want to be in the world as well. But
Yeah.
and that, I mean, within all that those traditions, it did include killing some of them, because the recognition was that they are killing us. They have killed us, that and that their project is to eliminate us or to subjugate us to something that is not a full life, right? And so it wasn't none of those traditions reject the use of violence or force in the process of liberation. But the idea is that you do want to be able to get to a place where that doesn't have to be used, and in doing it, you do have some thought process around, like, where do I draw the line here on how to wage the struggle in such a way that, I don't destroy myself in the process, and that I give you the potential to see the light of day, so to be able to see your way out of it. And obviously that's always a very complicated process, which usually involves excesses. It usually involves things that, we all look at and say, gosh, like, I don't agree with what happened there. I don't think that should have been the way that you waged that, but at the same time, that, I mean, we've read Fanon together, like the violence is there. It's brought by the colonizer or the imperialist or whatever. And so, it's not really our choice at the end of the day. We either die slaves, right? Or, we fight back, right? And I think the thing about the narrative in the Bible is that's not the story. Like, the story is not that, and there are places where maybe you can find elements of that story in the Bible, but this is this is not there.
Well, and I would say that, in the most generous way possible, like, and like thinking about reading some of the, like, if you were reading these things through Fanon or through something like that, or even like, even thinking about, the conversations around mercy and not in Ori's book, and going back to Robinson and asking those questions about that, like, if you read Esther without the rest of the tradition, you know what I mean? You could put it into you could put it into an understanding of that. Like, it doesn't go into the history of the violence. You know what I mean? So, like, you don't, like, you're kind of starting at a different place, but you could probably piece that together. You know what I mean? Like you don't become subjugated to an empire without, something happening along the way, But the issue is that somewhere in that deep past, the idea that you're the one who you believe created everything around you, for some reason has decided that this group of people, who you can kind of like identify as anyone you want, is particularly singled out for, their whole memory being blotted out, and in particular, like, the story being connected back to Samuel and what was, prescribed there for what should happen, like that, again, like, that flips it all on its head. You could read it as, like, these are the people who are loyal to a certain type of, system and way that things are going to be. So they're going to need to be tried or whatever and eliminated. I mean, that's not what happens in the story, but I'm just saying, the reason why I think it's good to discuss these things is because, well, first of all, like, they're not being forgotten, right? Like, they keep coming up. So, like, it's good to understand, I think, to some degree what's being brought up. The second thing is that the dismissal of them as there's lots of dismissals. There's lots of ways to dismiss them. Like if you are, if you're atheist, like obviously, like you can just take divine sanction out of everything, which is, more power to you. Like that's, I'm all in favor of that. Like that's probably the way to go. But the issue for like my kind of particular tradition, like the liberal tradition, like is that we like move to a place of like nonviolence. We move to a place of saying, okay, well, clearly this can't be what God wants because it like ascribes some level of violence being done, and we know that that's not who Jesus is. Like that's kind of like the move that's made. And so, but like also knowing like the history of the world, and like all of the struggles, for me, particularly the struggles that have involved liberation theology as being a piece of them, like in Central America, in those kind of areas, and then, parts of Africa as well, or even now with a religious element to your resistance, that side of it, the move to just say that we just embrace nonviolence is problematic. And so we need to wrestle with what this means. Like obviously we don't embrace this kind of this level of this level of violence and like the prescription of it, like just identify a people group and eliminate them, like clearly, like if that's where you've come to in your, especially in your spiritual journey, that's where you've come to, like you took a wrong step somewhere, like you're all, like something went wrong, like along the way. And you need to fix that. But again, like, how do we think about, like my folks in my church, that's like where they would be, like, nonviolence, like we just don't support violence, you know what I mean? But it's like, well, but you also like support the cops. You know what I mean? Like you think that they are like a necessary element to this world, that like, you may not phrase it this way, but like, they are keeping civilization, like they're the, like they're the boundary of civilization or whatever, like, in some place, that's even the most liberal conception of it, and so it's like, we are and we think it's morally wrong what's happening in Gaza, but like the idea, that we should stop sending, some people draw the line of defensive and offensive weapons. You know what I mean? Like that, that becomes an actual debate, that you, so you're, again, trying to read these things like along with Fanon or George Jackson or something like that, like it's not as easy, I guess, just to dismiss it whole cloth, just because, again, people are using it and you're contributing to like the genocide of other people by just like saying, well, let's go for nonviolence,
right.
Yeah. Like, because those people need to, like, this is their way to stop it. And you've talked about this on the podcast, and everybody's talked about it, but like, the people in Yemen, like the resistance in Palestine and any other group around, they are the people stopping it to whatever degree it can be stopped, and we, for the most part, are trying to do our little bits to keep people alive the best way we can, but a move into rejecting their violence, their counter violence, that's as dangerous as that. To me, that's as dangerous as embracing these texts.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
no,
that's the other side of it.
I absolutely, I appreciate it coming from you. Yeah. And I agree. And it gets to this contradiction of like, you and I have talked about October 7th, right? Also in the way that like liberals respond to October 7th, and this episode may end up coming out on October 7th too, and like, because we're about to approach the actual 2-year anniversary. And, the peace tradition, right, would say something along the lines of like, well, I don't like some of the things that Israel's doing, but October 7th was was really bad, right? And they would probably have said the same thing about 9/11 too, right? Of like,
Yep.
like, oh God, yeah, I don't love what we're doing over there, but hey, they did it to us, kind of thing.
Right.
And that's one of the things. And then you can call for peace, right? Like, I mean, and a lot of times these folks do, and I have people like
Mhm.
this close to me as well, and I love them. And,
Right.
they go stand on the corner with the sign and, say we want peace. And like, I'm all for that. Like, I'm not rejecting that.
I mean, I'm also one of those
Right.
people.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
at
Yeah. Yeah.
the same time as
No.
I'm saying this,
Yeah.
I mean, like,
No.
yeah, like a
And I don't have
yeah,
I don't have a problem with that, right? But what I'm saying is that, and I want peace too, right? Like that's the thing is, um, the, I mean, it is that whole question of, what comes first is, like, this is a aside, but my father, he still organizes with his church, and they had for a long time a peace and justice committee, and he made, like, his big, like, pat himself on the back, kind of moment a while back they told me about was that he made them change their name to the Justice and Peace Committee, because he said without justice there can be no peace, right? And
right, right,
I mean, it's cute on one level, but like it's also correct, right? Like it's not that
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's not actually that the peace
right,
part should come first,
right,
and then maybe we'll get to
yeah,
the justice afterwards. It's like, well, actually, no, we need justice
right,
in order for peace to actually be a
yeah,
possibility, right? And it's funny because I think for a lot of times with my own influences, of abolition tradition and stuff like that, I've had a kind of rejection in some ways of the idea of justice, because it's become so deeply embedded with me in the criminal justice system, right? And the way that which I see as an oppressive system in its entirety. But, and I think Dylan Rodriguez was the one who talked to me about this most on one of our episodes, that, justice traditions are, it's really important, and they're deep, and they go way back, and everybody has some version of it, right? And like this idea that,
right,
that there
yep,
must be justice, but again, like that's, like, genocide is not justice. And I think that that's this is the piece. And yeah, I mean, certainly, I like the idea of thinking about October 7th as a preemptive strike, as Abdul Jawad has said in certain ways. Or you think about it as a response that is required to try to change the conditions after 20 years of siege or whatever, you think about it. But
Mhm.
whatever
right,
excesses may have happened or people think happened on that day, like, it was a product of a
Mhm.
military operation that was targeting military outposts that were around a prison camp that was under siege, essentially. And I think
right,
that,
yeah,
again,
right,
like, there's
right,
no, Palestinians had tried all sorts of ways of non-violently, you know, removing this siege and changing the kind of conditions there. And I think that's the piece for liberals, right? That's like so hard for them to really wrestle with,
Mhm.
because, like, you mentioned the piece about cops, and it made me think of during the Safia Bukhari study group that we just completed, there's this ridiculous document which is a debate uh, between, it's not ridiculous because of Safia Bukhari, of course, but it's the debate between Peter Thiel, as in, arch villain, Ted Cruz, Safia Bukhari, I think Alan Berkman, and Ron Kubi, something, I think those are all the people who are participating. There might be one other one. I mean, which is just, I mean, it boggles the mind that in like 1998, Peter Thiel and Ted Cruz are sitting across from Safia Bukhari, and they're debating political prisoners in the United States is what the debate is about. But Peter Thiel says something that I think is kind of perfect, which is, Thiel says, Well, I would suggest that what we do is we don't condone violence, right? Because this is a central aspect of this debate, right? So they're debating about
Mhm.
whether there are political prisoners in the United States, right?
Right.
And Thiel and Cruz are basically like, the people you're talking about are all murderers. Like, they all killed cops. Like, this is the logic that they're
Right.
using, right? And so they're saying, like, they're
Right.
not prosecuted as political prisoners. They're people who murdered somebody, and everybody agrees that murder is wrong, right? So let me read this back and forth. Thiel says there's a very different situation when another country threatens the U.S., threatens civilians of Israel. He actually uses both, right? That's a big issue with Saddam Hussein, as opposed to
Mm.
violent individuals within a free and open society who choose to engage in violence. I'll agree, mistakes were made on our side. Mistakes were made on the side of conservatives.
Mhm.
What people did to the American Indians was terrible, he says. Bukhari says, I'm not talking about conservatives. We're talking about a government that has changed hands from conservative to Democrat over and over again and continues to be the same thing. Thiel says, I'll make it more general. America has made mistakes. I'll agree with that. But the question is, what do we do today? What do we do in practice in 1998? Bukhari says amnesty and freedom for all political prisoners. And then she goes into, before that, the basis of this, right? Talking about they're all coming out of these liberation struggles and so on and so forth. And that the times, had a revolutionary momentum and people took a violent road after the nonviolent roads were suppressed, right? And she's saying now we're in 1998. It's later. We should amnesty the
Mhm.
people who engaged in this form of action, right? Thiel says, well, I would suggest what we do is we don't condone violence. Bukhari says, on either part, the part of the government and the part of the people, you can't negotiate using violence because you have the means of winning, and then tell us we have to negotiate by words only. It's kind of like the sword in the neck thing from Ghassan Kanafani, right?
Yeah.
And Thiel says, this is the part I really wanted to get to. This is the way the criminal justice system works. The government uses violence to restrain even more violence from breaking out. The government's violent in prosecuting criminals, but that's to restrain even more violence. And basically, if we can't do that, the whole civilized fabric of society starts to disintegrate. Right. And so this is an interesting, this is like the classic, like Thin Blue Line story, right? It, brings up Andrew Crinks and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
that is the liberal, kind of mythology that gets them to the place where they can support police and where they can support military on some level and yet still think that what they're calling for is peace, right?
Yeah.
But in that contradiction, and there's fascinating moments in that debate because Safia also brings up, what did George Washington do? Did he, sit by and just petition the government and wait until they granted him his freedom and all of this? And so, but that's the liberal position on violence, and I think it's an important thing to note because Thiel, as a fascist, really, but as a
Right.
conservative, but he recognizes that very clearly, like, no, like you're right. Actually, we do authorize violence, right?
Mhm.
But our violence is to prevent even more violence, and on some level that sounds great, right? Like, it sounds like that you could say that within an anti-colonial struggle as well, right? But it's doing a lot of work. And also, as Safia points out, is like, yeah, with all of that, like, you never would have had South Africa change from an apartheid
Mhm.
system. Like, you never would have had, she uses the instance of Nazi Germany, like, you never would have liberated Jewish people from extermination camps or, communists or disabled folks or all the other people that were, terminated during the horrific, the Holocaust, right? And same thing with this genocide, right? That if our only response is just, lay down and pray for it to stop and to say we support peace, then, it they'll do whatever there's nothing stopping them from doing whatever they want to do.
Right. Yeah. I, there's a really, there's a few different ways I would like to, I would respond to that. But I think that like there's a really interesting article that I read by this rabbi. It was like written for the Orthodox Forum in March 2004. So like you're thinking 2004, that's right in the middle of the beginning of the forever wars. But it's called The Origins of Nations and the Shadow of Violence: Theological Perspectives on Canaan and Amalek. So talking about these two things. But like to what you were saying just now, like with the like this kind of selective nature of the violence. I'll just read this little bit. The original offense of Amalek, the particular nature of which we only glimpse through a fog of exegesis and homiletic, stands for a fundamental and radical enmity between God and the entire social political world of the nations. It is an estrangement that would justify in principle universal harem, which is that prescription type of war, which the last of the prophets in the closing moments of prophetic utterance offers as the dread alternative to eschatological reconciliation. The divine wrath is not expended on the whole of violent, rebellious humanity, but only upon Amalek. So, like, it's basically like, look, what you see in Amalek is that, like, there's God's people, this nation, and then really all the other people are at enmity with what God is planning. You know what I mean? Like, so let's be thankful that we have chosen just this one people to be the object of divine wrath. There's this other quote. Mitri Raheb, who's a minister in Palestine, wrote Decolonizing Palestine, but he has this I think goes along with it. Like he basically says, talking about kind of the post-war, post-48 kind of, we talked about this kind of in thinking about this, like the Judeo-Christian kind of like language that comes up, and then like the ways that Christianity embraces like the founding of the state of Israel. He basically says Palestinian rights to a life in freedom and dignity on their native land was the sacrifice offered by European theologians as restitution for Christian anti-Judaism and the Holocaust. So it's basically like, look, we realize that basically like us Europeans, like we might, we could all of a sudden turn our, colonial violence against the people within inside our borders. And, like no one is really safe from us. But, if we just center all of you in this one place and you can identify the group of people there as your enemy, like then maybe everybody else is going to be okay. Like as long as you know that those people there within that concentration camp and with that little area are your enemies, like just focus on that, and everything's going to be all right, for all the rest of us. And I think like, this is the devil's bargain, pardon the pun, that the liberal Christian theologians, as well as the conservative Christian theologians post-Holocaust, which, I mean, again, like completely understandable that you want to remove like the anti-Semitism from your tradition. Yes, this is something that you should have never let come in the first place. That's fine. But what you do with it and the text you use to justify it, that's a totally different story, and unfortunately in the United States, at least, like there were maybe like, early on, like just a few liberation theologians, who kind of were already caught up in anti-colonial, like anti-imperialist struggles that understood what was happening, but even the more liberal theologians didn't, like decided to embrace the state of Israel and basically create theological justifications for why the modern state of Israel is connected to the Israel in the Bible, and how that land is their land,
Yeah, appreciate it. And as you were talking about that too, the kind of, the sacrifice, right? Or this idea also of Christian embrace of the state of Israel, or the European, or the Western embrace of the state of Israel as this idea that would be imposed, upon Palestine, that it does also resonate for me with Ali Qadri, also thinking about genocide and thinking about, this idea that, you know, like historically we can cite all of these examples of, this idea that people create all kinds of different narratives around, manifest destiny, being key, but, many where there must be this sacrifice, right? Or there must be this enemy that must be blotted out, right? And it's history, I mean, the erasure of history piece is a really interesting one, because that is also like such a prevalent colonial technology, right? Too, is to try to erase the history of people, and like obviously it's
Right.
like
Yeah.
it's so. I think one of the hard parts, we've talked about this a lot since October 7th and since all the genocide, is just watching these things all play out and having it live streamed in such a way where it's like, they're
Mhm.
bombing universities, they're bombing archives, and we literally have the videos of them bombing these things. And, you know, the whole liberal tradition in this moment, most represented in this instance by mainstream media, corporate media, right, is silent on that issue, right? Like they, maybe every once in a while they'll run a little piece where they, but it's always the sort of like, well, Israel says there's Hamas tunnels, and or they were shooting rockets from this building or whatever, and there's no even journalistic impulse to dig in and like investigate to see whether that actually is true. you know, I mean, I reject it on its face, but like I recognize that for them, you could say, well, maybe you should look into, you know, see,
Right. Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, I think that what I'm grappling with in reading the Ali Qadri thing a lot as we're going through this is just the way that which I think is an important thing for us to really try to make sense of in this moment as we're in a time of genocide, is that the genocide is not the outlier, right? Or it is not the thing that, and that capitalism as a system, for instance, if we just talk about it like less, we take God, remove the example of Gaza for a minute, right? And talk about, say, the example of Congo, right? And we can say that, in order to get these really valuable minerals and
Right.
resources that are so important to the type of technology that we can profit off of in such a huge way, right? Or so essential to green technology, right? To all of these things, so-called green technology, that we have to sacrifice these people. And I always reference like that there's a local Democrat who I know because our kids go to the same school. And then there was this moment that I will never forget in which he was kind of trying to recruit me to run for like local politics, right? And I'm like, yeah, I'm not the guy, bro. Like, it's not going to work. But the thing that we started talking about was environmental stuff, and he's like, I drive an electric car, it was this kind of thing. And he was like, my brother sent me a documentary because I'd brought up the issues of the lithium and like that the car is not actually green and that, all of these things. And
Right.
he was like, well, he's like, yeah, my brother sent me a documentary about that. But he actually was able to articulate that, well, I guess if it's one nation that is going to be, going to have to deal with that sort of like horrific, if we have to sacrifice one group of people in order to save the planet and the system, then like that's probably, it's
Right.
like that sucks, but like, I
Yeah.
can live with that, I guess. And um I mean, it was wild to me to hear
Right.
somebody articulate it that way, but that's that, like you said, what made me think of that was you talking about this idea. Well, it's just Amalek,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like we're not saying like we're doing this to,
Right.
never mind that there's always another Amalek,
Right,
right?
right,
Like
right,
that, that,
right,
you
right.
know,
Yeah.
but yeah,
And you are never Amalek. I mean, that's,
right.
the key, the
I
key,
can't be
the
Amalek.
key point. It's just as long as I never become that, that's cool. Um, Something you made me think about when you were talking about, like right before that story was, the interesting thing about like the blotting out the memory, right? The way the text is constructed, right, is remember what they did to you, right? Then, like, basically in the Deuteronomy text, like you and God are going to blot out the memory of Amalek. Like you guys are going to get together, take take care of this. And then, like, then at the end, it's do not forget, you know. And what I like when you were talking about the media and everything like that, like actually when I think about it, like the construction is kind of perfect for like, okay, remember what they did to you, but don't remember what they did to you, but like blot out anything that might make you think that they are human or life or they had a life prior to what they did to you or that they deserve a life after what they did to you. Like you need to always remember what they did to you. But like you shouldn't remember you shouldn't remember anything else about them. Like that's the key. Like blot out anything else that might make you think, oh, well, this is just another people group like next to us, like that look the same as us, that eat the same things as us. Like, no, don't think that. Like, think about like this thing that they did to you, which may or may not ever have happened, you know, um, or like that if we looked at all of the circumstances might have been perfectly justifiable, like for like why this in your own narrative, this large mass of people that just destroyed like another group of people, like with like divine intervention is marching through our territory. Like, oh, like I don't know why we would attack you. You know what I mean? Like I mean, like so. But yeah, like the idea is just remember the evil thing that they did, and go ahead and like do whatever it takes to blot out any form of life or anything else that is there. But just never forget that, there's people out there that are going to do bad things to you. Don't ever forget that. And be ever vigilant that they will reappear, you know. And don't worry because God is on your side and you can blot out all form of life, like whatever it is, and it reminds me too of there was just recently a panel. There's a book called Theology After Gaza, which is kind of interesting because like that was kind of like there was a bunch of theology after the Holocaust kind of thing. So like, it's going to be interesting to see if we learn anything from like what went wrong before. And like, but one of the participants was talking about like, like there was a narrative before the state of Israel were formed that this was, a land without a people for a people without a land. And like now they're just actually manifesting that, you know what I mean? Like they're just making that happen. Yes, it wasn't true. Like it wasn't a reality, but like they're making it a reality now. Like that's it will be true. Like that's their idea. Like their idea is that this will become true, And in the midst of it, all you have to do is just keep remembering the bad thing that they did to you. Like I mean, we will hear an incessant amount of the horrors, like, we probably will be asked to condemn Hamas again, like, like over and over again, on this anniversary, like, but all of the other actual life and memory and everything of like what it means to be Palestinian is off the table, and that's like basically what these texts teach. Like that's what they're telling you.
Yeah, yeah. I was in my mind. I know there's a Paramount Plus series that's coming out.
Yeah,
yeah. It's a Paramount Plus series on October 7th, and yeah, I mean, this is how 9/11 operates. I mean, this is how, yeah, certainly October 7th operates, and for a group of people, I should say,
mm-hmm.
and it's how, I guess it's what I should say is it's how we are encouraged all, and not just encouraged, but sort of mandated to reconcile with these historical moments is to never forget. And again, I mean, like you said, the interesting dichotomy, or not, contradiction between this notion that we should never forget and also that we should eradicate. If we think about the Amalek story, but there's something about that too
Well,
that
it's like, I mean, it is perfect counterinsurgency, right? It's like, never forget, look at the picture of Ground Zero, watch the planes go into the building, but like do not think about like how that happened, who did it, like why we like went and killed a bunch of people that had nothing to do with it. Like, don't like blot that out of your mind. Like that is just like, that is so disrespectful to the dead. Like for you to even consider why this, we have a narrative for you already. Like, why do you want to think about this? Like blot that out. Like, just remember the thing that we're telling, never forget the thing that we're telling you to never forget,
Yeah.
Unless you're Tucker Carlson, then you can do a series on
it. The other thing I just wanted to say was I do have this visceral reaction to all of these texts that are labeled after Gaza or after the destruction of Gaza or whatever, like the way that in order, like this is my imagination, but I imagine what's happening is that marketing people are saying also to authors, like, this is the way we're going to sell your book. And so in some ways, like, some of these books may be great. Some of them I'm sure are not. But the kind of after Gaza industry, as we are still in a moment where the genocide has not been totally completed, right? Also, it bothers me in a certain way. I do have to say, I do have a part of me that kind of is angry at all of these authors for allowing their books to be called that as well.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. I think it was Nora, right, who was talking about Chris Hedges, like kind of making these like pronouncements as if Gaza doesn't exist, what I mean, or has gone away, I mean, there is a finality to the way the texts are titled that like is like kind of negates anything you might say in the midst of it. Like if you're already willing to say like, oh well, this is post this thing, like because what it is using Gaza as a placeholder, right, for like some things that are happening to Gaza, like it, like this like struggle that's going on now, it's using like just the name to like hold the place for all of the things that are going on, and then to put a post onto that is well,
right, it's like it takes the noun of Gaza, which is a place which cannot be erased, right? Like and a people, right, which will not be totally erased, right? And a history that will not be totally erased. And it makes it poses a finality to that I mean, if they said, if the books were titled after the Gaza genocide or something like that, that would sit differently with me. But it's sort of like, I'm trying to think of like if people said, after, like it's the naming of it that bothers me. That, like you said, that Gaza is supposed to stand into the genocide being enacted upon Gazans. And it's it seems like to me there's an implicit acceptance of this blotting out also in it that that we should wholly reject, as there are people who are like inviting us to help send them some money so that they can, buy tents and food and keep their children alive amid this, and as there are people who are still resisting and refusing these plans, which are just demanding that they surrender and give up their sovereignty,
Yeah.
and again, like even if people reject, even if you're in the camp, which I'm not in, that like totally rejects October 7th and all of that, like the notion that Palestinian people, should have to lay down arms forever and live in a non-sovereign space that's administered by Tony Blair, is just like,
Right.
this
Yeah.
is not a world that I am willing to accept either.
No.
Even if it comes to pass as in some preliminary phase, like it's not what people should accept as a finality.
Right.
So
Yeah.
anyway, that's just a little
Yeah.
rant
There's.
from
I
me.
mean. Yeah. Because I think it flies in the face of what Justin says. No end in sight. Right. Like in a way, like yes, that's a terrible thing that there's no end in sight. Like because all of this terrible stuff is happening, but like at the same time, don't put an end. Like don't put that end on it. Don't finalize it. Don't bring it. Yeah. I mean, like what the eschatology of this is, should not be prescribed by anybody but the people who are resisting right now. Like that. Like if you want to hear what they have to say about where things are going, fine. But putting in, already foreclosing it yourself, you know, or, in the worst case of what we're talking about, like claiming that the end was foretold, you know, thousands of years ago, and like there's an inevitable thing that's happening, that's playing itself out. Like, which is, again, this is like a piece of the rationalization that I hear a lot. It's like, okay, yes, this is horrible. I don't support anything about it. Like if you show me a very reputable place that I could give money to, I might give money to it. If it has some kind of CIA link, like in the past, like I'm happy to give some money to it. But like, if it's not like it's not an organ of the state, like, no, I don't think so. But in the end, like, sorry, that was, there's a whole
No,
backdrop to that
I can imagine.
I'll just say it real quick. And if you all who are doing this benefit end up watching this later, I don't mean anything bad about it. It's just, I know it's happening at our church, but like in doing this research, right? Like I was digging into like the post 67 kind of like dynamics in the church and like what happened post 48 and then post 67, like kind of in between those two things. But like there's a liberal branch of American Christianity. They're just like the realists, right? Like Reinhold Niebuhr and people like that who were kind of like, yeah, I know that like we're supposed to have these certain like kind of, like we're supposed to kind of stay away from this church and state and that sort of thing. But like, every once in a while, like we need the state to jump in there, take care of some things, like, and they kind of fell down the like supportive state of Israel line, even though they were, fairly liberal on other things. Well, and James Cone takes him apart pretty well in Cross and Lynchy Tree too about his racial stuff, but that's another thing. But he was recognized, as a liberal in that time. But like he starts working with a group called the International Rescue Committee, which like basically becomes a CIA, like works with the CIA, like in I mean, it does good things in like helping, refugees from after the war. And then like, of course, like becomes like just basically this completely anti-communist organ that, helps, the refugees and, or whatever from every communist place and like that whole sort of thing. But like, that's a reputable organization that you can give money to that, gives water and blah, blah, blah in Gaza. You know what I mean? Like, but it's like, well, yeah, but like they have a history of like only giving the stuff to the people who are going to defeat the people who, you know what I mean? Like, they give it to the, I don't know, whatever, the conservative element in this group to make sure that like their people get fed while, I mean, so like,
Yeah.
there's a like that element, that side of it is also the way that all of this gets used by the state or gets picked up by the state, is,
Yeah.
well, and I mean, the capitalists, basically, let's say that, let's not just say the state. I mean, I know we don't want to get into that debate, but, but like, get picked up by like basically like the engine of capitalism, you know, like you were saying.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, like if you read the counterinsurgency field manual, it talks all about like the groups like the ones you're talking about, right? And like how they play a role, right, in also isolating the enemy, right? And
Right.
so I think that's the, or in, you know, what they're talking about now in this plan is what's called DDR within
Mhm.
counterinsurgency, which is like disarmament, something, and rehabilitation. I forget,
Yeah.
but it's like basically this idea of like, what do you do with the, you know, the terrorist, with
Right.
the insurgent after it's over, right?
Right.
And you know, so you take away you disarm them, but also after that, they're going to have to go through some kind of program and process, which will, you know, which we're going to make sound really nice, but will involve, you know, torture and, you know, being forced to tell on all their, you know, people that they know that were involved and all these kind of things. But yeah, but these organizations, these humanitarian organizations who have a relationship to the state have a relationship to those processes as well, right? So
Right.
it's not supporting people directly in Palestine. It's providing food or water through, or some form of aid through a process that is
Mm.
involved in, you know, actually undermining, I guess we could say, Palestinian sovereignty or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then, you know, and then like if you, I mean, they also talk about like on their website, like, you know, about how they have all of these trucks of aid at the border. It's like, well, then why, like, okay. I mean, I realize you're doing some stuff still inside, but like, you know, like I can give money to people who are actually, you know, like it's going to be going there. Like it's not going to be like another truck waiting to get in, you know, like that. It's just, it's a weird, it's such a weird dynamic, but there is something about that. Yeah. The legitimacy, but again, and a lot of that again is associated with violence, you know, because people connect certain groups with the resistance, or connect, you know, are people, or those people are not condemnatory enough, you know, so I can't support that. You know what I mean? But like in the middle of you try deciding that you want to send some money to people who are being like intentionally like starved to death and bombed repeatedly and everything, you know, like genocided, like that's the mentality that like I don't know how, you know, like that's the thing that I don't know how we get out of. You know what I mean? Like that's the, and I think going back to Kadri, I mean, I think his comments about the white working class in the North are so imperialist in a way that like it's the water that they swim in, you know, that they don't recognize just the insanity of what they're saying, you know, when it comes to these sorts of things. You know, the idea that you're opposed to violence and are a United States citizen, you know, I don't know, like that you don't at least like walk out into the street, like, you know, every once in a while, like, and just start screaming your head off. You know what I mean? Or, you know what I mean? Like if you don't have that level of just feeling utterly insane with the contradiction of it, you know, like you're totally missing the point of what's going on. Like, you know, like this is, yeah. I had someone from my denomination call me, well, the local group call me just like to check in and stuff like that. And like, they were like, well, so how are you doing? I was like, you know, like, I mean, like, you know, that's the, like, how do you answer that question? You know what I mean? Like, you know, well, like, I don't
Yeah.
know. Like, do you know what's happening right now? Like, everyone is just like completely silent in the midst of the thing that we were taught to never be silent about. And that's the insane thing about this never forget, right? Like in the never again, like those two things together. That's the insane thing about it, knowing this trajectory of it, like in the, and what it, like that it comes out of this, like that's for me, like in some ways I was like raised on that, you know, in different ways, just like, hey, don't forget that like this horrible thing happened and we should never let it happen again. Like that, you know, like, hey, you know, if there's one moral compass that you can guide yourself by, like, in the midst of everything, like just know that like this is a step too far. Like, hey, that we should not do that. And like, now that it's happening, it's all the people that told me that, you know, yeah, I don't know. Like the one thing that I would say that we've kind of touched on and led into is like the debate, that's been going back and forth. Like, obviously, just like I don't think that the Israel lobby is the thing that's dictating, how our policy works. And there's material, like it's not the ideology, it's the material conditions, right? That's understandable. And I don't think that the Christian Zionist, like lobby or what, like, or whatever is the thing that dictates, or even this ideology is somehow like what dictates how things go, or even that it has such a sway on, Trump that's what, that he kowtows to its dictates or whatever, But I do think there's like some really like, there is some interesting things to think about as far as like, something you asked me about, like with the Judeo-Christian tradition and like when that language started being used. And we talked a little bit about it, like that it really comes up in that post World War II era, in this attempt to kind of like bring a reconciliation between how the Christians were completely like anti-Jewish for so long, and how, again, just like the good intentions of a relief agency, like the good intentions behind it basically just got used to promote, basically American exceptionalism, whiteness, and anti-communism. Like like all of that intention was swallowed up, in the Cold War era, like just to say like, actually what this means is whiteness, and Europeanness, and anything that you can glom onto that, like we'll call it Judeo-Christian. And with the formation of the state of Israel, like this balance between, okay, like this, as long as this place is doing well, we're doing well, like, and that there's like a mirror that's put up between, and that's like this bless and bless, curse and curse thing, like goes along with that as well. It's almost like just a straight up like guilt reaction, like we've got to do this because we were bad people, and we've kind of got to let them like do whatever they're going to do because we, which is, like that, that's not biblical. That's not how it works, and I mean, there's some really, I was just listening to the American Exception podcast, with Aaron Good. He was talking to someone about the transition from Kennedy to LBJ happening right at the time of the 67 war, that LBJ was basically like LBJ has these really strange connections that make him like this perfect amalgamation of Biden and Trump. Like, like he like was a Zionist, and he had these Marian Adelson type, like funders in California. And so like his support pre-war and then post-war, the way that like also shaped the trajectory of how the country and the church and the traditions that embraced Israel, it went from, the ideology segment of like reinforcing, these positive things about American exceptionalism mirrored in Israel, to, the very real, like we thought that maybe we were going to be, like have like some kind of tripartite agreement with like some of the Arab nations, and we were going to do this with Nasser and all that stuff, to like we're fully supporting Israel, and we're, to the detriment of everyone around, and like that's going to be our policy. And this, like the way that some of the Christian churches took this even was like, if you backed away at all, like and some tragedy happened, like it was because you cursed Israel, you know what I mean? Like, and so now you were being cursed, like that's how far they took it. But I think it also relates to, I remember like, I know you had Fred Moten on like really early on, like back, like the first couple of weeks or whatever after, or like, that, in talking about that lecture that he gave, when he talks about Israel as basically like the epitome of the nation state, or, I mean, and I think like the capitalist nation state, like they play that role in a way also for us. It's okay, as long as they're doing okay, since we share, the common values, like we're doing okay. But and also I think that what you were saying about what Kadri's saying, I mean, if you think about like the history of the state of Israel, it is the epitome of what he's talking about. It consumes the waste of all of those prematurely like killed lives or and that's its GDP, and exporting that around the world. Like that's how it survives. And we use it in that way, and we support it in that way. And in a way, the way that Amalek becomes this exception of being the sacrifice, I think in a way, Israel becomes almost this like scapegoat, like of our own, you know what I mean? Like in a way, like we are doing this, like we're doing this. And like, there's going to be a bunch of wringing of hands about what Bibi did. You know what I mean? But we are doing it. Like it is us. This is pure. And this is who we are, like to our core. Like it is a mirror. Like it's, like it is. And so like, that's a fascinating thing, like in a way, because it shows the roots of the anti-Semitism that still fuel the project. Like it, like that is still there. Like we want you to be the bad guys. You're the extreme in a way, like that make it, that make us. And this is this is what talking to Democrats, right? Like Biden was behind the scenes. He was negotiating. He was trying his best. They really, really believe that, And so they could just say, well, I don't know why they're so exceptionally evil. Like why they do such bad things, It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of interesting things about that history and how we got so connected, and, again, like some of it, has some really interesting connections with like the ways that, let me move into this. I'll say this last thing, because I think like the one thing that I want to talk about, like the legacy of this is Project Esther, like just real fast, because that, this is the addendum to like the Project 2025 that Heritage Foundation has put out, which is basically like combating, a national task force to combat anti-Semitism. And like the whole thing starts with an overview of the story of Esther. So like it tells the biblical story. That's like the first part of it. And at the end of the little that little storytelling time, it says, as this rabbi said so aptly points out, the character of Haman unfortunately is far from unique in the Jewish experience. As one bitter Yiddish proverb summarizes the unhappier episode of Jewish history, so many Hamans and only one Purim. Today, Israel, Jews everywhere, and Americans face yet another Haman. The question remains, will we face the threat as Esther did so many centuries ago, or capitulate to intimidation or fear? And it's just a classic Heritage Foundation document. You don't have to really read it to know what it's going to be talking about. But the things I thought were interesting about it is one of the things it says is why anti-Semitism is on the rise is, what was it? Was it Jake Tapper who was talking about, the anti-Semitism has been rekindled for decades before October 7th by the promotion of a view that reduces all human interaction to a heroic struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors. And then like it goes on to say how basically, there's basically a Hamas support network and Hamas support organizations around the world who are basically trying to tell us that the Arabs are the oppressed, and no matter what happens, and we have to stop that, But I want, like, why I started thinking about this is there's a part in here where they talk about basically how they're going to use like state apparatuses, law enforcement, and like legal codes and all of this stuff, RICO and all, like they're going to use all of this to go after things. And one of the parallels they make is like was the Bund movement in between like World War I and World War II, like which was trying to bring, Nazism basically, into the United States. And it talks about, it's like it says law enforcement and the underworld worked in parallel to target the Bund, basically saying, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, and then like Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, and all these people like, worked to, and then they say happily coordinated less than kosher activities pro bono to disrupt and thwart the Bund, So it's like, I mean, if you know like the history of like how these mobsters and the state were used like in Cuba and like happened to be like, you know, the some of the Zionist like support that goes on is like through these, you know, basically money laundering entities and criminal element. You know, like that's a whole like and that this document is basically saying like, hey, maybe the way to go about this is to find, you know, whatever law enforcement angle, and maybe there's still some kind of, you know, like CIA affiliated, you know, like counterterror groups that we can bring in, you know, from the criminal element who are willing to, you know, maybe there's a big jail in El Salvador. Maybe there's a, you know, maybe there's some way we can like take these people out, like in this, you know, we can have a new assassination program, you know, like with, I mean, that is, you know, I mean, again, like that this narrative of what you do with those enemies that you think are coming after you, again, like you're saying, like the counterinsurgency side of it, you know, the willingness of the state to use whatever form of violence it finds necessary. This document definitely has the hints all through it, you know, that they are willing to persecute, you know, I mean, which, you know, Project 2025 has a similar kind of things. But I just think in the time we're living in, that we're coming up on the second anniversary of this, and this document is out, and we're seeing it being put into place, you know, on college campuses. We're seeing it, you know, I think I mentioned to you that we're fighting an IHRA, like International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whatever definition in Wisconsin right now, being put into the books in the state. And like what they do with that is basically say that will be the guiding definition for all like government agencies. So like if you get picked up at disturbing the peace, if they need to find out whether you're doing a hate crime, like they go to this, you know, so they can add a felony on top of you're disturbing the peace, you know. So it's like, yeah, all this is happening. Well, it's happening, you know, the guy in Texas, right, with the graffiti. I mean, and so again, it brings me back, you know, these narratives, this way that they're used, it's fascism, right? It's like it's the same ideology that, I mean, it's just another tool in the toolbox. And, you know, we can dismiss it, you know, if we want to, you know. And I think you know, maybe there's bigger fish to fry, you know, out there, but like but at the same time, like it is being, you know, it is what gives kind of justification or gives credence to like like genocide, repression, you know, like all of these things. This is how they make it make sense, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't encourage anyone to dismiss it. I think it is happening right now, right? And you know, I go back to that Kaliakuno, those, you know, couple Kaliakuno discussions that we had, like, you know, right around the election. And I need to get him back on. But you know, like everything that he says, that he's like, yeah, I know y'all are gonna think I'm a little crazy here for saying this. It's all like, yeah, they're doing it and then some already, you know. And I think that, yeah, I mean, Project 2025 is not a document that people should dismiss, and Project Esther is already happening. And whether it's like officially Project Esther, right? Like it's like
Right.
like these are think tanks that are putting out plans that this administration
Right.
is like, hey, this is good shit. Like, let's do this, right? And so,
Right.
I think
Well, and I think the way it operates too is that, like, I mean, they're everywhere.
yeah,
Like, you don't have to okay it.
right,
Like the way that this bill got introduced in the state house, I mean, it was just like someone just threw it on someone's desk and they were like, anti-Semitism. Oh yeah, of course. Like you know, like, I mean, you know, like it takes no thought. And I mean, of course, the people who are doing it like have the idea that it might end up being repressive is, you know, I mean, the only people it's going to repress are these, you know, these unruly youngsters on the college campus that they despise anyway, you know.
yeah. Well, it's going to end up being used against their kids, is the
Yeah, yeah,
reality,
yeah.
right? But like, you know, but again, this is
And
like,
And the Democrats, the fact, I mean, like they're just like, well, we don't want to seem we don't want to seem to be anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
It's like, and like, well, we don't want, and also like, we don't want them to divide us. Like, it's like, so you'll unite on them. I mean, don't get me started. At least, I should, let me tell you this last little anecdote from my local Democratic Party. For some reason, I don't know why, you know what I mean? Like the local Democratic Party has had a Ukrainian flag and the flag for the Rebel Alliance, like the little like swoopity doopity, whatever that thing is. Like that's been the two flags outside of their office for, I don't know, like a year or two now. And like, I can't help but talk to people just about like, okay, well, like you realize that like at least a part of this show that you're like this flag that you're representing. I mean, first of all, like it's a total armed resistance unit. Like, like there's no way of escaping the fact that like they're completely militaristic. That's whatever you want to say. And then like in the most recent kind of iteration, like they're like trying to figure out how to stop a whole genocide going on, like so maybe like we should, think about that. So then like this Jimmy Kimmel stuff happens, right? And they actually take down that flag because I guess it's a Disney product, right? And they put up an American flag. You know what I mean? Like it's like, well, what I said was like, oh, they probably finally finished watching Andor and realized that flag is like anti-genocide. So they figured they better take it down because like, they don't want to seem like they're against anybody who's committing genocide. And then they put the American flag up just to be clear that we are pro-genocide all the way. And I don't get me started on the Ukrainian flag, but I mean, I just don't like the level of whatever that is. I don't even know what that is, but like, it's just like, you're just like, what in the world? Like, what are you guys? Where are you guys? What world are we living in? Yeah.
Yeah. I look forward when we get to the part in Ali Kadri's book where he talks about like the absurd, right? And this, and the absurd, like that part of this, when you have a capitalist system that is based upon, structural genocide and the accumulation of waste, right? That like, that in that process, the absurd becomes real, like everything, like all of the things that you think you believe in, right? Or that, like, I don't know, I don't understand, I mean, obviously at some point, I describe myself as a liberal at some point in my life earlier on, right? But there's a whole set of circumstances that led me out of that space, and it's a process, and it's still like I'm still unlearning,
right.
My liberalism. But I have a hard time thinking back to a part of my life where like I was so just like, you could throw this symbol at me or that symbol, and like my whole world would just be like, oh, like, I just think it's only through a kind of realm of selective ignorance. And I guess the other thing I was going to say about the Project Esther thing is I think even that, what I think happens is that we don't want to, when we start to think about the level of violence that we are close to facing,
Right.
Psychologically, certain things happen to protect ourselves from going into that mode, right? And so for a lot of us, it doesn't kick in until it's really fight or flight time, right? And then you're like, oh shit, it's too late. I haven't put everything in place that I need to. And I think that's something, I mean, it's probably one of the reasons why we need organization too, right? Is like we need people around us to also be like, no, like we actually have to do this. We actually have to prepare in certain ways, right? Because it's as an individual, there are all of these enticements to say, well, that's, I mean, in my example, I have the fucking Manhattan Institute like watching all of my podcasts to look for like stuff to clip
Right.
out to then go after
Yeah.
guests. It's like,
Yeah.
and there's still a part of me that wants to sit here and think like, I mean, I can let all my guests know like that potentially could happen to you, right?
Right.
But beyond that, it's like, well, what, what does that mean about how Project Esther thinks about
Right.
me? And what do
Yeah.
I need to get in place to prepare for
Yeah.
that reality, right? And
Right.
that's a thought that comes across my mind multiple times a day, right? But I'm still like, I still need to do things to actually prepare for that
Yeah.
because it's here,
Don't get me started, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Garden in every yard and factory in every garage. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't got there yet. I got. I want to say this in case, like any fellow ministers slash people of faith that come from a Christian tradition are watching. You know, the shame, the shame, the shame for all of us who might have been, might be in this tradition at all, is that if there's anything that we were supposed to have learned from our tradition, is that like the inevitability of facing death when you have to counter empire and stand on the side of the oppressed is the foundation. Like it runs, you cannot know who Jesus is as a historical figure or not. Like the story, you can't read it without realizing that this is the reality that we live in. This is our reality. Like if you want to witness on behalf of the people who are being oppressed by whatever empire is going on, they're going to try to kill you and imprison you. This is the New Testament. This is like what the New Testament is, besides all the craziness going on. That's the fundamental through line. And the idea was that, you know what, in the midst of that, like we could form communities who like, provide mutual aid for each other and like share meals together and like, prepare for whatever we can do to keep each other somewhat safe and somewhat together in the midst of that. So the fact that we were not already on the front line of this all along, and maybe not necessarily in any kind of like, lovey-dovey commune kind of way or whatever you're thinking in your mind, but like the fact that our churches are so far away from that understanding, especially in the midst of what's happening right now, is just a complete condemnation of our understanding of who we are as people who like think that we should look to Jesus for something. Like whatever degree you take that to, wherever you're at, that's just a shame. And I just want to make a quick couple plugs. My progress from wherever I was as a liberal to wherever I am now has, a lot to do with listening to this show and watching it. So to Josh and you both, yeah, like I wouldn't be where I am today, like without your assistance. So I appreciate that. And then also anyone out there who is not a part of the Patreon and gets information about the study group, maybe you should just drop a couple dollars a month or so, because those study groups are, besides listening, participating in those has been, the biggest, one of the other big things that's helped me along the way. So big thank you there.
Thank you, man. It's been great to get to know you throughout all of this. When you first showed up, I thought you might be the ops. I didn't know what was going on. And it's been really good to build a relationship with you over the years through the study group, for some of your help transcribing episodes, and just through discussion and communion. And so I appreciate all those shout outs. And it's 8 years tomorrow. We're gonna do a live party. Josh is gonna come through. Actually, we'll get him on YouTube for the first time. So
oh wow, nice.
So anyway, it will already be out by the time people are watching this. But so it's been quite a journey for us as well. And the whole thing, I think, for both of us we've talked about this before, so I think I can say it from both of us, but a big part of the thing was sort of like, we knew we were on a journey and we had an idea of what we wanted to do for ourselves in terms of political education and learning. And I think we both felt like it would be quite selfish of us to just do that by ourselves, and we could share it with people. And so, when I cringe even thinking about some of those episodes in the first couple of years, right? Like, because if people actually listen to the show, front to back or back to front, like, you're watching us go through a process of learning and unlearning that, has been long, and it's still ongoing, and there's still, we're still on it. We're each on a different place of our journey, but we go through it together. And so, much appreciated, Darren. It's been great.
Hey. It's all true. No, I appreciate it so much. Yeah. And hey, thanks for this conversation. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's good. And actually thanks for just asking to look into this, because I think, like, for me, it's been helpful to think about. And then, like, with this Project Esther thing coming across our organizing space, like, at the same time, like, that's been fortuitous to be thinking about all this at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks again, man.
All right.
Bye.